I was hired as a mechanical engineer at a place that made machines to test computer chips. These were robotic sorting machines that ran first, picked the parts from a tray and put them into a boat. Then the boats ran around a conveyor system and were temperature conditioned to test temperature, then tested, then brought close to room temperature, then sorted into their sort categories. So the new manager, Mr. Arrogant, his name was Tom G., was hired. A tall, good-looking, and arrogant man of the privileged class. You know what I mean. I didn't report to him directly, but secondarily. Dotted line, as you will. Due to attrition from the dot-com bust, I know I was responsible for the conveyor system of this machine, which was being cost-reduced in a new model. The second-generation model with more features but cost-reduced. Like that'll work. Anyway, this guy was the king of not being responsible directly for anything. His skill was design review attendee. He didn't manage anyone or anything directly, but he attended every design review. He studied them all, and every one he would find a flaw. Then he would pounce. F you up. Find something you or someone did wrong, wait for the right time, and aha! You screwed up. Look how stupid you are. Then he would exit with a strut, looking for the next design review. I'll try to explain this for context. So I inherited this design that was screwed up. Whoever designed it decided to change the design in a way that it wouldn't work. It would take a bit to explain fully, but long and short, the system is at its heart a temperature chamber with a conveyor running around it as a rectangular track. Hot temp set point was 160 degrees Celsius, which is 320 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold set point was set with liquid nitrogen and was negative 60 degrees Celsius or negative 76 degrees Fahrenheit. All normal materials expand with heat and shrink with liquid nitrogen and shrink with cold, and the new conveyor was aluminum. It was mounted differently, and the end stops were mounted directly to the conveyor itself, and the end stops moved about 0.08 inches, 2 mm hot, and 0.4 inches, or 0.04 inches, 1 millimeters cold. But the alignment needed to be maintained to about 0.03 inches, 0.08 millimeters, for the system to work. The old system did this by making the end stop mount to the base plate of the machine. The new end stops mounted on the conveyor in the chamber and moved with the conveyor as the conveyor got hot or cold. This avoided extra holes in the chamber. I explained to Mr. Arrogant's dotted line boss that this wasn't going to work. I calculated it, drew it in CAD, and worked on part feeders for the last 5 years in machine automation. For robotic assembly, he dismissed me, called me young and inexperienced, and you don't know much, and we've had a design review, so you don't have the authority to change it. Fine, I wrote down this quote and the date in my lab notebook, CYA. Per Mr. Arrogant, Tom G., I am not to change the design. I also drew the ideal conveyor design and put it on my desk and went back to work. 6 months later, with the system being a jam-o-matic, I roll on in and walk past a meeting with the VP, Tom, my boss, and a couple engineers, and some others, and they have a conveyor sketch on the whiteboard, and Tom is discussing the conveyor and how it is jamming. I'm called in as I walk by. "What do you know about this?" says my boss. "Let me get something." I run upstairs and get my lab notebook and a cup of coffee. Well, I advised that the conveyor be changed a long time ago, but Tom rejected it. "See here?" I gave it to my boss, who read it, and he passed it to the VP, who read it, and said, "You're on it. Go fix it, please." It took another year for his incompetence to be recognized to the point he was let go. He was made to manage a project for real, but he refused. He was then made to, or else, he ran it to the ground and was terminated. Total, worthless jackass. F you, Tom. Some years ago, I worked at a logistics facility, and leadership had a way of adding workload to middle management. Rarely did any of them last more than 3 years before they either got disillusioned or changed jobs somehow. After working the floor there for 2 years, I was promoted to a team leader, and after 3 years as a team leader, I became shift leader, managing a shift of about 60 workers. We did pretty well. No other shift at this or other facilities could match our KPIs, and we did a lot of cross-training and on-the-fly adapting to the ever-changing needs of the company and current orders and workflow. I found the work to be interesting and challenging until I got a new manager who bent towards micromanaging. It didn't take long before he wanted me to write a detailed log of how I spent my days, hours, and quarter hours. I told him this was a really bad idea, but if he wanted this, I would of course comply. The first week I accounted for every 30 minutes with a line or two, thinking this was enough of a waste of time, but I was soon informed of my mistake. New boss wanted more details and every 15 minutes accounted for. Again, I told him this wasn't smart, but I got overruled. The next week, I made sure to write 4 or 5 lines for every 15 minutes of the workday, like writing down the names of the workers who took the early lunch and who took the later lunch. I wrote the same lines for every 15 minutes if the task took more than 15 minutes, and so on. To his credit, he actually followed up on a few things the first 3 weeks, and if he had kept doing that, I wouldn't have complained much. But of course, he gave up after a couple of weeks. I noticed this when I made a reference to one of the follow-ups and how we had failed that specific metric for a good reason, but never heard anything from him. So from then on, I suspected he had stopped reading my logs. QMC. After keeping the logs honest for a few weeks more, I felt secure that he never read them. I started adding a few tidbits of my own making. At first, it was a line telling him that if he used a certain phrase when talking to me the next week, I'd buy him a soda. He never used any of the phrases, and thus never got free stuff. An example of a phrase could be pineapples are best served hot, or apples are sweeter than oranges. General statements, but unlikely to pop up randomly in conversations. Boss still claimed he read every single one of my reports, and ridiculed me for claiming it was a bad idea. As the weeks went on without having to pay up, my MC kept getting bigger and bigger. Eventually, I promised him $100 in cash if he would talk to me about a specific picking location in our facility during the next week. He didn't. But of course, I also started writing many relevant things into the logs, like questions for him on how to solve potential problems, telling him he needed to start planning for vacations well in advance of the holidays and such. Still no response in any way, shape, or form. If you really did read them, why not use them to get questions and potential problems on the record? So after a year of writing logs that were never read and hadn't been opened since I saved them in the assigned folder, our great leader got himself into some trouble and tried to shift the blame onto his underlings. We didn't appreciate that, especially when the cause of the trouble was written in clear text in these logs from the very first moment we discovered there might be a problem, all the way up to where it was an ongoing hindrance that cost us more and more time and money every week. Eventually, a big meeting was called with all of us foremen, team leads, shift leads, and middle managers, with several big brass observing our boss, trying to fix the situation. Whenever he went for one of my people, I stood up for them and told them I took the responsibility for the entire shift. There was no need for him to call out my people because I was there, and it was my responsibility. A gleam in his eye told me he was about to make me the scapegoat, and I sat there calmly while he tore me a new one. He didn't hold back and really gave me his all, to such an extent that several of the big brass started stirring uncomfortably. They could probably sense he was overplaying his hand. After the tirade petered out, or he had ran out of steam, I asked him if he was done. And if he was done, if I could reply. He agreed and leaned back in his chair, confident in his character assassination of me. I took out my laptop, connected it to the big screen so that everyone could see, and opened the folder where my logs were saved. I pointed out that they hadn't been opened in a while and that track changes had been activated and no changes had been logged by his user. My user was the only one that had made the logs, edited them, and saved them. I then went on describing the log entries where the problem was discovered, how we tracked its development and maturation in the big problem it was today. One of the best moments was when I could show everyone that we had in fact suggested several solutions to the problem many times. I had also logged that we had several meetings discussing the problem, its causes, and probable solutions, sometimes even directly asking my manager what he thought about them. There were no logs that showed we had told him about its problem many times, in many ways, but no logs of any solutions or response from him. I was so focused on the presentation, I didn't really look at my boss, but when I was done, I glanced up at him, and I can safely say I've never seen a face more angry than his. He was furious. But of course, his boss and his boss's boss was there, right next to him, so he couldn't do much. His boss asked him if he had anything to say for himself, but he didn't really. He claimed I had edited them later and filled in details not known at the time of writing, but he was obviously reaching for anything to save himself. One of the big brass asked about a phrase he had seen. What's so special about picking location? I told them all about my little joke and how my boss had missed getting tons of free sodas and probably $400 if he had merely said the magic words each week. Amidst general laughter, I was told to leave the meeting along with anybody with my pay grade or lower. 3 hours later, some security guy emptied his office of his personal belongings, and 2 weeks later, a new boss arrived from another facility. It took him 3 days to ask about pineapples and other apples, and he had made sure that there was nothing wrong with the aforementioned picking location. He also told me to keep the logs more general and only a few lines for each day, but to also mention things of operative importance directly to him. My new boss and I had a great relationship where he left me and my shift mostly alone, and we kept topping out KPIs for the rest of my time in the company. Micromanager boss that was fired eventually found a new job at a lower level at another company, but only lasted about a year. 5 years later, I saw him selling used cars in a neighboring town. Life hadn't treated him well. Not to this degree, but I used to work in a warehouse on the second shift. My boss asked me that I leave a brief note to her and the day shift lead about any issues from the night. One time she started bitching at me about something that needed to be done but had not. I told her that I had in fact informed her of the issue and went back 3 or 4 days on the notepad I used and showed her. The response was, "Well, you don't expect me to remember that stuff, do you?" I should have thrown in the towel right there. But this is a story my great-grandfather used to tell. He worked on the railroad for more than 60 years. He started out laying rails and ended up as a conductor on the commuter line. Everyone called him Pop. The railroad hired his time study man to improve efficiency. He would run around with a stopwatch and clipboard, making life miserable for the train crews. He would issue general orders that detailed the proper way to do their jobs, from shoveling coal to blowing the whistle to punching tickets. Anyone who failed to follow a general order could have their pay docked. Passenger safety was very important. Despite the warning signs, passengers would get off a train and walk across the tracks instead of using the pedestrian underpass, and sometimes get smacked by a train coming in the other direction. Obviously, these accidents caused further delays and additional work for the crews, which cut into profits. The passengers didn't like it much either. To prevent this, the timetable never had 2 trains in a station at the same time. Of course, they were the inevitable delays, and a train going in one direction would pull in before the other train had left. The time study man came up with a brilliant solution. He issued a general order to all conductors that said, when 2 trains are in a station at the same time, neither shall move until the other has left. When the conductors asked for clarification, they were told to shut up and obey. It took about a week until there was a delay. Pop's westbound train was just about to leave a station when the eastbound train pulled in. He told the engineer to sit tight. Meanwhile, the conductor on the other train saw Pop's train and told his engineer stop. As the minutes ticked by with passengers on both trains getting rather annoyed, the station master sent a message to the dispatcher that the line in both directions was blocked. Pretty soon, trains from one end of the line to the other were stopped. That prompted a message from the dispatcher demanding an explanation. Pop sent a reply that he and the other conductors were just following the new general order. The dispatcher ordered them to get their trains moving, and that was the end of the time study man. My stepdad's father worked in rail. He had some horrific tales to tell the grannies, like freight train stopped, no comms from the driver, a local driver who lived nearby got called out to be the first on the scene. This was way back before cell phones. No driver, just stopped. Another crew saw the driver walking along the tracks miles from the train. Turns out he hit someone, stopped the train after a mile or so. Heavy train riding metal on metal takes ages and a distance to stop. Driver got out and looked to see if the man was embedded in the front. No, just a body and a face print dent. Just turned and started walking home several hundred miles away. Never found the man he hit, and the driver never rode a train again. Great stories. Used to work as a CVS pharmacy technician. At the time, I was studying for board exams to get into residency. I graduated medical school abroad and needed to pass board exams to get into residency to practice medicine in the US. Last year, because of COVID, my last board exam was postponed 1 week before taking it. It was rescheduled 2 weeks later. It was the only time slot available that would let me apply to residency within the time limit. Problem is that I couldn't find anyone to cover my pharmacy shift for the rescheduled date. I told my pharmacy manager and she told me that it was my problem and I had to find someone. I was a part-time tech making less than what the job was worth, but it got me by. So I endured, knowing it was only a temporary thing. Anyways, come exam time, I couldn't find a replacement, so I was like, screw it, and missed my shift to do my exam. I got to work the next day and she fired me on the spot, even though other people she liked more missed days all the time and no punishment ever happened to them. It's no issue because I managed to get into residency across the country. I moved there and have no regrets. Now the petty revenge. She called me a few weeks ago and asked if I was interested in coming back to work. Apparently most of the techs they hired quit 3 to 4 weeks into the job because of the horrible work environment, because of customers and other staff. She has no idea I moved to another part of the country. I was about to say no, but the devil in me made me say sure. I asked for a higher salary though, and she said she'll talk to her district manager and get back to me. A few days later, she called me and said that she pulled a bunch of favors and got me a $5 raise, per hour obviously. She sounded desperate, poor thing. I told her to shove it. I was in residency living my dream while she's getting yelled at because the coupon for Kit Kat bars wasn't working. She began to yell at me. I just hung up and laughed my ass off. I was thinking that you could have accepted verbally and then just ghosted her on your start date, but that would probably screw over the rest of the staff more than the manager. I really thought about doing that. I was so committed to this, and I thought about saying yes, flying back to my old city, coming in on the first day, and quitting 2 minutes later. Alas, no time off unfortunately. Damn. The only thing to make it better would have been if you accepted the offer and just never showed up or answered any calls or texts from her again.